Welcome my beloved student, how you doing? Hope you all are doing great and lovely. In this video we are gonna see, what if Deku was a superior demigod? This is part 1, and for more amazing content, leave a like, share and subscribe. And I wanna thank the author of this story named I'll Never Leave Your Side by SweetBbyFox. So do check out and leave kudos. Let's get in the video. Pathetic. That's what his life was. He tried to remain positive, really. His mother was in a better place now, she was going to be okay, and that's what mattered most, but getting evicted and fired in the same week sucked. He barely had any money now that he was the only one paying for his apartment, and he'd missed too much work when his mother was sick to even try and convince his boss to keep him. So now he was homeless, jobless, really the most alone he'd ever been, and for someone normally so positive he really couldn't help feeling so bleh. It had certainly never been easy for Izuku Midoriya. Growing up he'd almost always been lonely. Friends were scarce, as he was often bullied and teased for his smaller frame and shy mannerisms. After his parents married and before he was born, his father got into gambling which quickly grew into an addiction that cursed the Midoriya family with thousands and thousands of dollars in debt. Then after losing a particularly huge bet, Hisashi Midoriya up and vanished, leaving that debt for Izuku and his mother to deal with on their own. Izuku did what he could to help out, despite being so young. He did odd jobs for his neighbors, yard work for the elderly, and walk dogs for busy pet owners. But it still wasn't enough to keep his mother from working herself to the bone day after day for his entire childhood. As soon as he was old enough to get a real job he did, and so his own high school life was spent focused on his studies and working, leaving himself with little to no time for hobbies or potential friends. And then Inko Midoriya grew sick. Over the years she gained weight as her health dramatically declined from overworking herself. It wasn't until she had to be hospitalized that Izuku finally put his foot down and demanded that she rest. Otherwise, she was going to end up working herself to death. Izuku wasn't the only one who felt this way. Inko's older sister called the day after she'd returned from the hospital. She offered for Inko to live with her, explained that she had a spare bedroom and she could help nurse the woman back to health. Then eventually, she'd help Inko find a less stressful job in her countryside town. The only problem was, Izuku couldn't come. On the phone, his aunt claimed it was because she wouldn't have room for the both of them in her tiny home. "Sorry hun," her slightly accented voice had sighed, "it's gonna be crowded with your mum here enough already, there's just no room for a growing boy like yourself. Plus, ain't you old enough to be on your own now anyways? You'll be fine." He wasn't fine. It took less than 2 weeks for him to lose his job and get kicked out of the apartment he'd spent his entire life in. So now, he sat under a streetlight on a cold bench with a duffel bag full of his clothing beside him and a backpack of his few important belongings rested on his back. The park he sat in was mostly vacant as it was late in the night. Frogs croaked from the bushes, a soft breeze whistling through the air. He leaned forward, running his hands nervously through his dark green, unruly hair. "Stupid dad leaving us with debt, stupid mom not taking care of herself, stupid me not taking care of her, stupid aunt for taking her from me." Izuku's voice softened as his shoulders slumped. "I don't mean that, I just really miss her." It was late and getting a little chilly. Izuku turned to the duffel bag, unzipped it and searched for something to keep him warmer. He pulled out a teal hoodie and put it on quickly, huffing out in frustration as he felt his eyes water. The tears came hot and fast down his freckled cheeks, unstoppable as he held his hands in tight fists and tried to swallow down the sobs in his throat. Where was a lonely, emotional loser like him with nothing but his simple belongings and maybe some spare change going to find a new home? He didn't want to be homeless. He was still practically a kid. Izuku heard a distressed voice call out, "Someone. Someone help me." Looking up, he saw a patch of trees relatively close by. At the base of one particular tree, a little terrier was barking, jumping at the tree's trunk and wagging its short tail in excitement. Up in the tree's branches, Izuku was shocked to find a beautiful woman, clutching the tree as if her life depended on it. He grabbed his bag off of the park bench and rushed over to help her. "Young man," she wailed, noticing him approach, "please get that dog away from me." The dog noticed Izuku as well, and without having to coax it, it turned and ran to him eagerly. He knelt down beside the dog, gave it a good scratch behind the ear, and then shooed it away. From the tree, the pretty woman let out a sigh of relief and then gracefully dropped from the branches, landing on the ground with a soft click of her boots. She dusted herself off of any dirt and then came forward to put a hand on Izuku's shoulder. "Thank you so much for saving me," she smiled warmly, then after dropping her hand added, "I'm not much of a fan of dogs." He chuckled, scratching the back of his head bashfully, "I didn't do much." At Izuku's embarrassment, she laughed lightly, her voice sweet and lovely. Her hair was long and a shimmery black, tied up in a high ponytail that fanned out wide and dramatically. She wore a red coat, long white skirt, and expensive-looking leather boots. There was a sense of importance about her, the way she held herself with confidence and grace. Though dark, her eyes were incredibly inviting and warm, her long eyelashes fluttering every time she blinked. She couldn't have been older than 25, her face soft and youthful. "I've been gone for quite some time," she explained to Izuku as they returned to the bench he was sitting at earlier. "Are you also from around here?" "Yes," he nodded but looked at his hands with a sad polite smile, "though I guess I don't have a place to call home sweet home." The woman tilted her head curiously, voice full of polite concern. "What do you mean?" Her eyes slowly grew wider and wider as Izuku dumped his story onto her, giving her full details as he rambled on. She listened intently, nodding at appropriate times and making little sad hums when Izuku explained why he now found himself homeless. After running his mouth for almost 10 minutes, Izuku gasped in horror. "Oh my god. I got carried away," he yelped, leaning away from the woman. "You probably didn't want to hear any of that, I'm so sorry." She giggled, hiding her mouth behind her delicate pointed hand. No, it's alright." They sat together in silence for a moment before she asked, "You must hate your parents for leaving you, right?" Izuku considered the question, but shook his head. "No. I hated my dad at first, mostly because of how much he hurt mom. But I've found that I feel a lot lighter and happier when I just forget about him. So I don't hate him, I just feel indifferent to him now." "And your mother?" Another sigh escaped Izuku's mouth. He sat up straight, looking up at the stars that twinkled above their heads. Without his consent, the moisture returned to his eyes. "I could never hate my mother," he said, wiping the tears with his sleeve before they could fall down his face. "I love her, but I can't help feeling hurt that she left me so quickly. But, that's selfish of me, right? She worked so hard and deserves a break, deserves a much more peaceful life. It's like Auntie said, I'm an adult and should be able to take care of myself." "I'm sure it hurt her dearly to have to leave you," the woman said kindly, handing Izuku a clean tissue. "I have to shamefully admit that I too abandoned someone who really cares for me." Izuku blew his nose quickly, and then the woman added with a dry laugh, "Shadow is bound to turn me to ice as soon as I show my face around." "Ice?" She nodded. "He's very cold. But a very good person. And I'm sure I've hurt him greatly by leaving him at our home on his own." "Well, I'm glad that you at least have a home to return to." "I wish I could say the same," Izuku muttered, but then widened his eyes at the realization that he'd worded his thoughts aloud. "That was so rude of me. Sorry, it's just been a rough week." She shook her head, then gently took one of Izuku's hands and looked him straight in the face. "Would you like to have my home?" Izuku blinked. "Excuse me?" "I said," the woman continued in a soothing tone, rubbing the top of Izuku's hand softly, "would you like to have my home? It would really relieve me of my current burdens if someone else took over." He opened his mouth to protest, but she quickly added, "And, you are far more worthy of that house than I am." She moved her hands up to his face and cupped his cheeks fondly. Izuku was speechless under her gaze, a deep flush of pink quickly took over his face. His heart raced as she leaned closer, pushed his bangs back, and then lightly pressed her lips to his forehead. "Here," she said, pulling a folded note from her pocket, "this is the address. I also drew up a map to help guide you, though I apologize for my lack of artistic talent." Izuku gasped in bewilderment, his face practically steaming. "I can't." She cut him off again, putting a finger to his lips to shush him. "Please. Don't say no. Tell them Momoyae Rozu sent you. They'll be sure to welcome you as their new lord." She wasn't kidding, Izuku said to himself as he examined the poorly drawn map. The drawing was almost impossible to decipher. It had looping scribbles he hoped were meant to be streets and little puffy shapes that he assumed represented trees. Or maybe clouds. There was even a large ink smudge on the bottom left corner, blurring half of one of the streets. Izuku did his best to follow it, despite the mess of a map that it was. He found himself in a part of town he'd never been to before. The streets were dark and vacant, and the further he walked, the more suspicious he began to feel. It was almost silent, the only sounds were his breathing, the light tap of his bag bumping into his hip as he walked, and the occasional squeak of his bright red sneakers. Soon the buildings all but vanished, and only trees remained along the path he walked. His stomach filled with knots of anxiety and he considered turning back. "I should be almost there, according to the map." He mumbled, the note held tightly in his shivering hands as he looked around. It was getting late and he wished he was in a warm bed. Izuku pulled his hood over his head, tying the strings into a bow to keep it secure. A few yards ahead, he spotted some steps leading into somewhere he couldn't quite see because of even more small thick trees blocking his view. He stuffed the note into his pocket and sprinted to the steps. Turning to face his destination, he gulped almost painfully hard. "This has got to be some kind of sick joke." He groaned as his legs began to tremble, threatening to buckle at the knees. In front of him stood the tall gates to an old, run-down shrine. He approached cautiously, like a timid mouse, trying to get a closer look at the shrine. It was illuminated by the light of the moon above him, just barely giving off enough light for him to see where he was going. The wooden exterior looked worn, uninviting with its old molding paneling. Some of the surrounding trees were beginning to bear like they'd run out of life, and dried leaves scattered the grass and path to the shrine's entrance. It was all way too creepy for Izuku. His entire body shook with aggravation, and so with a final huff, he turned to leave. Until he heard a high voice ringing in the air, making him freeze in place. "Welcome home, Momo-sama." It rang. The second, more rough voice added, "Momo-sama, welcome, Kiro. We've been waiting for you." Izuku took a step back and looked around, unable to figure out where the voices were coming from. A chill ran down his spine. He tried to turn and run, but the gate was suddenly blocked by a wall of ice. He reached out to touch it, but immediately pulled back as the freezing surface stung his fingertips. The wall rose higher and higher, tall and confining, causing the frightened young man to tremble. His face paled as the voices called out again. "Momo-sama. Ghosts." He shrieked and rushed towards the shrine, desperate for a place to hide. The door gave a shrill creak, but obliged as he pushed against it at full speed. As soon as his feet made contact with the ground he started sliding, his feet slipping out from underneath him and making him land hard on his back. Izuku let out a pained wince as he tried to sit up off of the cold floor. It was no wonder the ground was so slippery when it was covered with a thin layer of ice that stretched out to the walls as well. It wasn't just the floor and walls that were cold though. Even the air was chilled, his struggling breaths coming out in little clouds of condensation. The door he'd ran in through suddenly slammed shut, causing his heart to jump out of his throat as he shrieked. A mysterious fog began to roll into the room, obscuring his vision even more as he squinted into the darkness. "So you've finally returned, Momo-sama," a mocking, irritated voice growled in the air. A pair of eyes appeared, practically glowing with rage. One was a shimmery, almost golden brown while the other a striking turquoise. The rest of the figure was imperceptible with the fog, but Izuku had seen and heard enough to know he needed to get out now. I'm not," Izuku frantically babbled, but was cut off by a loud shattering sound. From the direction of the glowing eyes came a dangerous wave of ice that dashed over the floor and clung to Izuku's feet, trapping him in place. His ankles ached as he tried to pull away, quickly losing his balance. He landed back on the ice, but first. With no success at escape, he realized with ever-growing dread that he was trapped. "Please." He whimpered, voice almost inaudible. "Where have you been the last 20 years?" The voice was closer now, and the room grew even colder. Izuku shut his eyes, readying himself for whatever finishing blow was going to kill him. A heavy hand grabbed one of his shoulders, long sharp nails poking him through his sweatshirt. It was abnormally hot, especially in the current temperature of the room. He heard a sharp inhale, and then the ice was gone, and the pressure of the stranger's hand was off his shoulder. His feet and butt felt damp, but also numb from the puddle of ice water that formed around him. Cautiously, Izuku opened one eye and peered up at the man above him. The face looking down at him was very controlled, almost blank, but Izuku could see there was shock underneath that layer of coldness in the way his eyes widened. He blinked at Izuku curiously, You're not Momo?" "I'm not." Izuku's confusion only grew as he tried to register what was on top of the person's head. Were those fox ears? Before he could keep looking at the strange man in front of him, he was distracted by two small, human-like creatures who suddenly appeared on each of Izuku's sides. One of them wore a baby pink kimono with golden shimmering stars patterned across the fabric. Wrapped around her was a navy blue obi belt that matched the Zori sandals on her feet. Her hair was chestnut brown, short, and framed her round, rosy cheeks. She had large brown eyes and long, wispy eyelashes that made her appear doll-like. She looked over Izuku with wide, wondering eyes, clinging to the sleeve of his damp hoodie. How can this be? The other creature was slightly less human-like. She had long, dark green hair that reminded Izuku of the color of his mother's hair. It was tied at the end like a bow. Long bangs laid down the middle of her forehead. Something about her was oddly amphibious, the way her body hunched forward and the way her long thin pink tongue stuck out from her mouth. Her hands were incredibly large in proportion to the rest of her body, as well as her eyes that took up most of her face with their long bottom lashes. Like the other girl, she too wore a kimono, but hers was a pale green fabric, patterned with golden flowers and branches. Her obi was a dark teal, and her Zori were light yellow. Her voice was the rough one Izuku had heard earlier. It was gruff but still feminine, and he realized it sounded similar to a frog's croak. "They have the mark of the land god on their forehead, Kiro." She tapped Izuku's forehead, her skin warm on his, and continued, "I sense Momo-sama's spiritual energy, it's unmistakable, Master Shadow," she said, addressing the fox man. "Well, he's not Momo," the fox man repeated simply, and then he looked Izuku in the eyes, "And so who are you exactly?" So he was Shadow. To say he was overwhelmed was a bit of an understatement. Izuku opened and closed his mouth like a stupid fish, trying to comprehend everything that was going on. He thought back to meeting Momo in the park earlier and remembered how she had kissed his forehead. "She kissed me?" he practically screamed. The frog girl nodded her head like everything made sense, and the short-haired one giggled. This was so confusing, Izuku's head was starting to ache and he just wanted to lay down, close his eyes, go back to sleep. Maybe this was all a dream. The man, apparently Shadow, knelt on one knee to be eye level with Izuku. His eyes narrowed as he stared and Izuku suddenly felt like he was being judged by a critical eye. Izuku found it near impossible to keep eye contact with Shadow for more than a few seconds. His heart was racing and he felt incredibly nervous and small. If he was being honest with himself, the guy was gorgeous. His straight hair was cut at his jawline and was two-toned split down the middle of his head. The left side was a deep red, like the color of a rose, and the right side was a pure white. His pointy fox ears on his head were also different colors, matching their appropriate side of hair. Over his turquoise eye on the left side, he had what looked like old scarring, but it didn't take away any of the attraction that this man clearly possessed. His jaw was sharp, his face pointed and fierce. The way his eyes were shaped was also sharp, bottom lashes lined in red, and despite the coldness behind them, there was a heat that made Izuku feel like he was burning under his gaze. Shadow was dressed in traditional clothing like the girls, a low-cut white yukata with a black haori over it. He was barefoot and his fingers were long and almost claw-like. Behind his body, twitching slightly, was a long fluffy two-colored tail that split red and white down the middle, just like the hair on Shadow's head. Yakai, Izuku realized. I'm surrounded by yakai. The fox yakai reached a hand out and grabbed Izuku roughly by the chin. Another squeak escaped from his mouth and he felt himself blushing harder under Shadow's intense, scrutinizing gaze. His right hand was cold on Izuku's face, but his skin was incredibly soft. Shadow's expression was unreadable, lacking of emotion, making Izuku feel even more uneasy. Shadow let go of Izuku after a moment and stood up, stepping back a little. "Momo kissed you. And what else?" Izuku sighed in relief at the sudden space, just here, on the head. He used the arm that the short-haired girl wasn't clinging to and pointed to the spot on his forehead, "And she told me to come live here. Here's the note she gave me." Excusing himself from the girl's hold, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the folded map that Momo had given him earlier. He handed it over to Shadow's expectant hand. Both girls left Izuku's side to look over Shadow's shoulder and read the note with him. Izuku took this chance to stand up again, so he didn't feel so small and awkward on the floor. He tried to ignore the dampness in his jeans. The short-haired one spoke first. "That's definitely Momo's beautiful penmanship. And horrible drawing, Kiro," the frog girl added bluntly. Shadow looked away from the note in his hand and back to Izuku. "Momo was the land god of this shrine," he explained, the irritation this time clear in his voice. "So the owner of this shrine is the god of it, and now that she's made you the lord, you are now a land god. And that makes us your shrine spirits, here to serve you the best we can." The short-haired one shouted gleefully, "I'm a Chaco." "I'm Sayu," the frog girl croaked with a smaller but equally friendly smile and a little wave of her large hand. Izuku gave them a polite but wobbly smile in return. "I'm sorry. But there must be some kind of mistake. I can't be a god. My name is Izuku Midoriya, and I'm just a normal human. Nothing godly about me." He laughed nervously, scratching the back of his head. Shadow nodded his head at that. "He's right. He's much too plain and weak to be a god. I doubt he'd be able to do much around here besides maybe count the money offerings and weed the gardens." His tone wasn't menacing, it was rather monotone, but Izuku still felt a little insulted, especially as Shadow continued, "I can't accept anyone like him as the land god. I'm tired, I'm going back to sleep." "Well, wait." Izuku stuttered. "Well," the girl shouted out, "Master Shadow, please wait. Don't say that." The fox yakai was already turned around, ready to leave, but Ichako yelled out, "It's our duty to happily welcome Izuku-sama." Shadow gave Izuku a quick glance over his shoulder, then said to the shrine spirits, "I am Momo's familiar, not his. If that boy stays, then I'm leaving. Find someone else to replace me, he is not my duty. Good night, Achako-chan, Sayu-chan." It was odd to Izuku how offended he felt by the way Shadow said boy. He couldn't help feeling dejected, he wasn't ready for this new and crazy responsibility. Shadow left the unfurnished room, most of the ice vanishing with him. Dew trickled down the walls, while the floor shimmered from the frosty coating. The two girls moved to stand beside Izuku, looking up at him with concerned expressions on their sweet faces. Standing beside them, Izuku could see just how small and childlike they were physically, as their height stood just below his waist. A yawn escaped his throat, and he rubbed his eyes slowly. "You're tired, Izuku-sama," Sayu pointed out gently. He looked to the frog girl and gave her a small, but clearly unhappy smile. "I guess I am." Ichako pulled on his sleeve, leading him down a hall. Let's get you ready for bed then. We'll make a comfortable resting place for you tonight. Izuku thanked the two shrine spirits sincerely. They offered him dry, comfortable pajamas to sleep in, and once they finished the bed arrangements, he laid down quickly, pulled the warm blankets up to his neck, and fell into a deep sleep for the rest of the night. He couldn't wait to wake up from this bizarre dream. It had been at least 5 years since Izuku had woken up feeling so refreshed. He sat up slowly, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, and let out a satisfied sigh. His thoughts were fuzzy. He vaguely remembered some kind of crazy dream where he'd been kicked out of his house by the landlord and a strange but beautiful woman gave him her old, run-down shrine temple of a home. The dream had been full of odd people, cute childlike shrine spirits and a handsome but chilling fox yokai. Thank goodness it was just a dream, he laughed to himself as he sat up. I can't even imagine being an actual god. The little spirits were cute, but that fox yokai sure hated me. Master Shadow doesn't hate you, I think. A voice croaked from beside Izuku. Izuku let out an undignified scream. Ichako giggled behind her hands, while Tsuyu smiled sweetly. She tapped her chin slowly with her rather large index finger, as if in thought. Would you like some breakfast, Izuku-sama? Ichako fluttered her long eyelashes at Izuku, rosy cheeks bright and cheery. So it wasn't a dream. Izuku deflated weakly, I don't have much of an appetite right now, but maybe in a little bit. Thank you, though. She nodded, her hair bouncing as her head bobbed up and down. She turned to Tsuyu, shall we show Izuku-sama some of his duties as the land god? Tsuyu gave a croak of approval, and the two girls pulled Izuku out of bed. Despite their short heights and small frames, they were both strong. He tried to object, but they simply shushed him. In a matter of minutes, they brushed, or at least attempted to before giving up, his hair, changed him out of his pajamas and into a traditional olive green yukata, and were pushing him out the door and into the backyard outside of the shrine. It was too fast for him to feel proper embarrassment, but his head spun with overwhelming confusion. They handed him some gloves and a rake. Time to cleanse the yard. Ichako exclaimed, floating beside Izuku and throwing leaves into the air. Unlike us, when you clean it'll give the whole shrine a sort of cleanse. So get to it. The yard behind the shrine was huge, full of various plants and trees. On one side there was a large garden that had a variety of vegetables, herbs, and fruit. Scattered about were many flowers and bushes, colorful and inviting to the many butterflies that fluttered about. Some of the trees bore fruit and blossoms, while a good majority of the others were bare and losing their leaves, despite it being the middle of spring. Surrounding the yard like a fence was a dark, mysterious-looking forest. He quickly got to work, raking up all the dead leaves, sweeping the porch, weeding and watering the gardens, and pruning the trees. It wasn't that he disliked the hard work. There was something both peaceful and satisfying about doing it, even if it felt like he was doing free labor. But after going at it for a few hours he could feel his arms starting to ache. He climbed up a tree, spotting a thick branch that looked like a lovely place to sit. The tree's cool trunk was pleasant against his back, and he briefly wondered if he'd be able to take a small nap and stay balanced. With his long sleeve, he wiped the sweat off his brow and closed his eyes. There was a harsh breeze, and then suddenly the branch Izuku had been resting on started to lean as if the weight had doubled. Izuku's eyes quickly opened as he scrambled to grab something to catch his balance, but when his hand instead made contact with a very cold ankle, he let out an alarmed shout and stumbled backwards off of the branch. With oof. He landed painfully hard on his back, gasping for air as he felt the wind knocked out of him. Shadow leaned over slightly, peering down at Izuku with an uncomfortably blank expression. He sat with one leg stretched out while the other was bent at the knee, his elbow comfortably rested against it. His red and white tail casually swung off to the side, hanging off the branch with the laziness of a carefree cat. It wasn't until Izuku sat up, hand on his chest as he took deep breaths, that the yokai straightened up and then gracefully slid off of the tree branch. His landing was silent, a good foot of distance between him and Izuku. His yukata was a navy blue this time, the color bold against his pale skin. It was almost unfair how elegant he looked just standing there, staring at Izuku, as if he was waiting to see what the pathetic human would do next. I'm alright. Izuku winced, face red with shame as he clumsily stood on his feet and brushed the dirt off of himself. Shadow blinked at him, I didn't ask. Oh. Alright. Izuku muttered awkwardly, did you need something? No. I was just coming to see if I needed to clean up after you, Shadow said simply. The statement was almost rude, but his voice lacked any hostility, making Izuku feel even more unsure of how he should respond. Do you? Shadow's mismatched eyes scanned the yard, face serious, until he flickered them back to Izuku, no. Your work was sufficient. Great. Izuku said sarcastically, turning to walk back inside. He was incredibly uncomfortable and self-conscious in front of Shadow, his fight-or-flight instinct greatly leaning towards the latter. "You're weak," the yokai spoke up, stopping Izuku in his tracks. "Do you really think you can take over the role of a god?" Izuku looked to the ground, a dejected sigh escaping his throat. He was barely considered an adult, and based off his height and small frame, people assumed he was younger than he was. If he was being honest with himself, he wasn't particularly good at anything impressive, he wasn't the strongest, and he definitely possessed no special magical abilities or powers like a real god would. But still, there was one thing Izuku always took pride in. And that was his determination. He never quit trying to do his best, no matter the situation. What other option did he have, anyways? He didn't have anywhere else to go, he needed some place to live, and so he was going to try his best to be considered worthy to the other inhabitants of his new home, whatever that might mean. "I might not be good enough now," Izuku said, his voice shaking but earnest, "but I'm going to work hard and do my best, and I'll prove to you and anyone else who doubts me that I'm capable of doing anything. He turned back slightly, looking up at Shadow's face. It was still stoic, but his eyes were widened a fraction more as if he hadn't been expecting Izuku's response. "I'll be going inside now." Unspilled tears began to rim his eyes, and he cursed them under his breath. "Not now, be strong." He could feel himself practically marching as he headed to the back porch, hands balled into fists as he bit his lip in frustration. Ichako rushed to his side as soon as he entered the shrine. "Is everything alright, Izuku-sama? You look like you're about to cry." Sayu offered him a clean handkerchief, which he accepted and used to dab at his moist eyes. "Thanks. I'm alright, don't mind me." He let out a shaky laugh. The shrine spirits were unconvinced, but they were respectful to not push him either. Sayu hopped ahead into another room, while Ichako took Izuku's larger hand and followed her. They had him sit beside a small floor table, on top of it a humble arrangement of food. There was a plate of sliced apples, another with rice balls, and one more with sliced tamagoyaki. Ichako offered him a large glass of water which he accepted with eager gratitude. "Thank you for the food," Izuku said, digging in. "I have some questions," he said after swallowing a mouthful of food, looking up to the girls who were knelt across from him. Sayu smiled. "What is it, Izuku-sama?" He twitched at the honorific, but shrugged it off. "Can you tell me a little about Shadow?" "Master Shadow used to be a wild fox," Ichako said thoughtfully, "but Momo-sama took a liking to him and decided to make him her familiar." Izuku nodded. "Is he powerful then?" "Very. He's a very well-known yokai and respected." Ichako was cut off by Sayu. "You mean feared or despised, Kiro?" the green-haired spirit croaked. Ichako gave her a pointed look, but then smirked. "He's respected by many. He has ice and fire abilities that are very strong." This didn't surprise Izuku, but it did make him more curious about the fox yokai. If he was so strong and well-known, what was he doing serving for gods like Momo? Izuku wondered if maybe it was because they had a romantic relationship. For some reason, the thought made his stomach churn uncomfortably. It was also interesting to him that Shadow had both ice and fire abilities. He'd had yet to witness Shadow use any fire, but then again maybe that was a good thing. Fire was dangerous in a natural setting, and as a magical power Izuku was a little nervous about the strength it must have. He quickly finished his food and thanked the girls for providing it. Now time to continue the deep cleaning. Ichako grinned as she clapped her hands loudly. Izuku groaned, but accepted his fate. "Let's get this over with." After a few more hours of cleaning the entire shrine from top to bottom, Izuku lay outstretched on the clean bare wooden floor. For God, he sure felt like he was doing a lot of tedious work. He had considered asking Ichako and Sayu for their help, but he assumed that if they wanted to help him out they would have already offered. Or maybe even had done the work before he became a god. Even so, they looked happy and content to be doing their own thing. He caught them doing a different activity every time he came across them. Once they were playing cards, another time they were painting each other's toenails, and on one occasion he found Ichako braiding and styling Sayu's long hair. "Cute," he thought to himself with a soft smile. "The shrine looks wonderful," Sayu said, standing over him and letting her long hair tickle his forehead. Izuku gave her a tired smile and replied, "I'm glad. I'm sure it could be much better, but I'll keep working at it. It's the least I can do for being able to live here." She shook her head, moving away to look around. No, it really looks great. It hasn't looked this clean since Momo-sama was still here, Kiro. Master Shadow did his best to take care of the place in Momo-sama's absence, but it has been hard for him without her. Hard for all of us, without a god's presence." Izuku sat up and rested his face in his hands. "Are they a couple?" he asked nervously, biting his bottom lip. "Boo. Master Shadow and Momo-sama." Ichako laughed loudly. "Oh no. Their relationship is purely platonic, in fact Momo-sama has no interest in men." He nodded his head in response, unsure of how to feel about her answer, and they remained silent for a moment. Izuku considered himself. In all honesty he had no idea what was expected of him. If his duties meant just keeping the shrine clean and presentable, then maybe he could do this. Though he doubted it was that simple. His fingers ran lightly over the soft fabric of his yukata, he admired its simple beauty and felt a little self-conscious and out of place wearing something so traditional. He was much more used to his casual hoodies and jeans. Blessed God, a frail voice suddenly spoke, soft but clear in the room. Izuku looked around the room in confusion, but then noticed someone outside of the window. He hurried over to the glass and peeked out. There, knelt in front of the shrine, was a small old woman. Her frail hands were up to her face in prayer, eyes closed and her expression earnest. Despite her mouth remaining closed, Izuku could hear her voice as if it was playing on a speaker in the room. Please bless my daughter today as she gives birth to my first grandchild. I beg that she may be safe and that the baby may be strong and healthy. She bowed her head respectfully and remained still for another minute before standing up and leaving. I could hear her, but she wasn't speaking out loud. Izuku said in awe as he turned to Ichako and Tsuyu for some sort of explanation. What you just heard was the prayer of the worshipper, Ichako said proudly. The prayer wasn't spoken out loud, but you heard the words coming from her heart. Tsuyu added, this is part of your duty, to listen to the wishes of the land. Before he could ask anything else, they both rushed out of the room. He sighed, looking back out the window to where the woman had sat praying. There was a peaceful feeling of reverence over him, something he wasn't used to feeling. The girls were gone for almost 10 minutes before they returned. When they did show up, Tsuyu was leading the way as a huge stack of notebooks hovered between the two shrine spirits. Ichako held her hands together, connected at the fingertips as her cheeks puffed out like a fish. Sweat dripped down her brow and her eyebrows were furrowed in deep concentration until she finally let her hands go and the stack of books dropped from the air. As the brown-haired girl sat down to catch her breath, Tsuyu rushed over to straighten up the stack. It towered over her short body and was almost as tall as Izuku. Izuku approached the pile of notebooks cautiously, what is all this? They're for you to read, Izuku-sama, Tsuyu said, I'd start right away, Kiro. It's the records of every prayer from every worshipper for the past 20 years. Master Shadow has been listening and recording them in these books so that once Momo-sama returned, the people could be blessed by the land god. Ichako exclaimed, floating up from the floor with a wide smile across her red face. Shadow did all of this? For the last 20 years. Izuku gaped as he picked one up and flipped through it. The notes were incredibly detailed, pages filled from top to bottom in careful, beautiful penmanship. Not only was each prayer written perfectly word for word, Shadow had also included details of how each person looked and dressed, the expressions on their faces, and how many times they had returned. An incredible amount of care and consideration has gone into it and Izuku felt a little choked up. Why did he do all of this? Izuku asked in disbelief. Momo-sama was gone, Ichako sighed sadly, without her light on the shrine, it was slowly falling apart. People didn't want to come, they could probably feel the lack of a god here. And yet he still tried to make up for it. Master Shadow is very loyal, Tsuyu said. Ichako nodded and continued, without him and all of his work, this shrine would have fallen apart years ago without its god. Despite his dedication, the shrine hardly gets any visitors now. That old woman is a regular though. She's been praying for a grandchild for quite some time now. Izuku placed the notebook back on top of the pile and then slowly reorganized the stack, making new, smaller piles for every 4 years. The pile for the last 5 years was noticeably smaller than the others. His lips frowned at the discovery. He handled each notebook carefully, as if it were fragile, and then once finished he sat down, picking up the oldest one and began to read. Tsuyu brought him a cup of tea and Ichako draped a blanket around his shoulders. He thanked them profusely and then let himself be absorbed into reading the prayers that Shadow had so diligently written. Tears slowly slid down Izuku's cheeks as he closed the third notebook that he'd finished reading. He felt the notebooks were incredibly sacred. Some of the prayers were heartwarming, some were agonizingly sad, and some were so inspiring and hopeful they left him a little breathless. Izuku was so touched that for 20 years, Shadow stayed and listened to all these people. There had been nothing forcing him to stay, and there was no one stopping him from getting up and leaving. Izuku didn't know exactly what kind of relationship Momo and Shadow had, but he knew that it was incredibly strong. His chest ached, it hurt that Shadow had no faith in him, but he also really didn't blame him. He'd only met Momo for that short moment and he could still sense that she was very important. Izuku knew that his presence lacked anything similar to Momo's. So he made his decision. It took him a few minutes of searching, but after finding himself to be alone he awkwardly called out, Ichako. Tsuyu. With a poof of smoke, both girls appeared in front of him. Ah! He cried as he backed into a wall. I need to get used to that, he exhaled, clutching his chest as his heart raced. Ichako gave him a wide smile, what can we do for you, Izuku-sama? Do you know where Shadow is? I'd like to speak to him, he said to them. The two girls glanced at each other and then Ichako hesitantly responded, yes, but it's a little far from here. In another world to be exact, Kiro, Sayu croaked, blinking her large eyes at Izuku. His eyebrows raised in surprise and with an excited grin he asked, can you take me? Ichako and Sayu each took one of Izuku's hands and led him to the woods in the back. They explained to him that they were able to travel world to world at ease, but it's something he wouldn't be able to do intentionally anytime soon because he was just a human. He tried his best to not take that as an insult. Sayu explained to him that where they were going was the world over yonder. In the shadows of grassy fields and wells, all the dark places in our world serve as entrances, she said as they walked along a dark path that to Izuku didn't seem spiritual or out of the ordinary, lying between our world and the netherworld as the world of the supernatural, Kiro. It is the place they say humans unexpectedly stray into when they peer into the darkness. As if out of nowhere, Izuku and the girls suddenly stopped in front of a large foggy gate. Izuku was unable to see much around him besides the dark trees, and the gate looked as if it had nothing on the other side of it. The shrine spirits pulled him along into the gateway. As he entered, light seemed to flicker on, vibrant reds and oranges and yellows danced in front of his eyes. They stood alone in a vacant but brightly lit street, full of old wooden shops and buildings that were lit with warm paper lanterns and lights strung from rooftop to rooftop. Despite all the sounds and lights, no one else was out on the street with them. Welcome to the land of Yakai. Ichako said, looking up at Izuku's odd face and squeezed his hand encouragingly. The two shrine spirits went ahead of Izuku, Ichako floating about happily, while Sayu hopped forward on all fours in long, large leaps. He was fascinated with the buildings, everything was so traditional and handcrafted, with its own kind of historical beauty. Every so often he'd see a face or figure watching him from a shop window, but when he'd make eye contact they'd quickly disappear. It left him confused but unafraid. They didn't seem threatening at all, and the girls seemed unconcerned. Master Shuou too. Ichako cupped her hands around her mouth and called out loudly. She continued to yell as they hurried down the streets, occasionally taking random turns down alleyways and walking down new, but identical streets. Izuku felt a little scatterbrained and lost, but continued to follow the shrine spirits closely. Every time she called out, he flinched slightly at the intrusive volume of her shouting. I sense that he's this way, Kiro. Sayu said, grabbing Izuku's sleeve and pulling him down yet another alley. Ichako followed behind Izuku, making light humming noises in agreement, mmhmm. MHMM. He's this way, I can sense him, too. Instead of exiting the alley, they made a sharp turn into a doorway Izuku wouldn't have even noticed if Sayu hadn't dragged him into it. They walked down a warm hallway, lit by dark red lights glowing along the walls. Its intensity strained Izuku's eyes so much so that he had to squint and look towards the floor. Master Shadow. Ichako called out again. This time, a strained voice yelled back, it'd be much appreciated if you stopped causing such a racket, Ichako-chan. Behind him, Ichako sighed, I know where we are. Ugh, don't tell me he's training again. Training? Izuku questioned as he followed Sayu into a more naturally lit room. His jaw dropped and Sayu bounced up to tap it closed using her hand with a huff of laughter. They stood in what appeared to be a training dojo. Around the room, ice sculptures stood tall and sturdy. Some were melting more than others, while some were missing limbs or looked like they'd been aggressively attacked and chipped away at. Shadow stood off to the side, stretching his arms over his head. Izuku gulped, unable to stop the blush that crept up his face. The fox Yakai was shirtless, wearing nothing but black baggy pants that hung low on his hips and cut off at the calves. His right side looked almost frosty, patches of ice clung to his skin that sparkled against the white lights from the ceiling. On his left side, sweat glistened off every muscle from his neck down to the dip in his hips. Keep your mouth shut, Sayu winked at Izuku, or you'll catch flies. Izuku let out an embarrassing shriek, which he tried and failed to disguise as a cough. Shadow wiped the sweat off his forehead and turned to the girls, awkwardly avoiding any eye contact with Izuku. Did you need me for something? I told you I have no interest in being his familiar. Ichako levitated herself eye level to him, hands on her hips and voice stern, Master Shadow, you know better than to overexert yourself like this. You're covered in ice. Are you trying to make yourself sick? Shadow glared at the floor, his face resembling a scolded child, it's fine. It's only a little ice. Last time you trained like this, you were bedridden for 5 days, Sayu pointed out and handed him a dry towel. Shadow nodded his head in thanks and hung it around his neck. With his left hand slowly moving over the ice along his right side, he melted the ice chunks that clung to him with a harmless red flame that flowed from his fingertips. His body seemed to be steaming. Izuku looked back over his shoulder shyly, eyes wide with fascination, his blush still remaining in the form of pink dusting over his freckles. Let's get you home, Master Shadow, Ichako pleaded, it's not healthy for you to train yourself so hard like this. Momo isn't there, and now she's probably never coming back, Shadow said coldly and turned away from them. Without her, that place is not my home. Ichako huffed impatiently, you sound like a child. We have Izuku-sama now, Tsuyu croaked in an attempt to be comforting. He is not her, the fox yokai stated as he gathered his clothes and began to dress himself. Izuku took a deep breath and with clenched fists and tightly closed eyes, he stood tall and shouted, I don't need you, Shadow. You're free to go. There was silence. He opened his eyes cautiously to see the three others staring at him in shock. Ichako and Tsuyu's mouths were open in surprise and Shadow was still where he stood, arm half into his sleeve. His brows furrowed in confusion and he opened his mouth to ask something, but Izuku cut him off. He laughed nervously, scratching the back of his head. The words poured out of his mouth, fast and clumsy but full of emotion. It's just. Ichako and Tsuyu told me everything you've done for the shrine since Momo had left. I know you worked really hard and I wanted to thank you. I also know that you don't believe in me, which sucks, but like it's whatever. I'm not going to force you to be my familiar. So you can go, do whatever you want. You can relax now. I don't need you. He looked to the floor, feeling a little lost, but also relieved to have spoken. He turned around to leave, but looked back to Shadow and added, I really am grateful for all you've done. I'm sure Momo would have been really proud. He heard Ichako and Tsuyu call out after him, but he continued walking down the halls and back out into the street, by himself. Shadow turned to the shrine spirits, why did you even bring him here? He demanded, quickly putting on his yukata. Tsuyu shrugged, he said he wanted to talk to you. Ichako sighed, hands on her hips as she glared at the fox yokai, you know he needs you, Master Shadow. A god needs a familiar. He can find his own familiar then, you heard him, he doesn't need me, Shadow ran a hand through his hair in frustration, blending the reds and whites together, do you two not realize how dangerous it is for a human to be here? He's a land god, Master Shadow, Ichako defended with a roll of her eyes. Shadow let out a low growl, that's even worse. The shrine spirits looked at each other, realization dawning over them, oh no. They shouted in unison, rushing past Shadow and calling out, Izuku-sama. Together they hurried out into the streets calling his name. Ichako floated through the air quickly, while Tsuyu hopped even faster ahead of her. As they called out his name, they'd wait and listen closely for a response. Suddenly they heard a frightened scream. They rushed in the direction of the scream, matching expressions of worry over their faces. Back at the training dojo, the yokai stood alone in silence. He took a deep breath and then began to wrap his calloused hands, muttering to himself in confliction, why did Momo pick you? It didn't take Izuku very long to realize he was lost. Everything looks the same, he muttered to himself, green eyes looking around to try and recognize anything that could tell him if he was walking the right way or not. There was still the occasional face peering at him from a storefront and on a few occasions he had even tried to wave but continued to get no response back. Izuku walked until he found himself at the dead end of an alley, facing an empty wall. He shoved his hands in his pockets, sighed loudly, then turned around and away from the simple brick wall to explore another street. But as he turned, he found himself face to face with a young man with painfully dry, chapped lips and crackling skin. The man had pale, messy blue hair and small piercing red eyes. He opened his mouth and gave Izuku a spine-chilling grin. You must be the new land god. The man said with a hoarse, scratchy voice, standing low with posture that had to be hard on his back. Izuku startled, something about this man was incredibly wrong and he felt himself starting to panic in his presence. Maybe. I guess. The man took a step closer, despite his hunched posture he was still taller than Izuku. His gross, hot breath tickled Izuku's bangs, you're still fresh, it's painfully obvious. New gods are always so easy to smell. What's your name, human? Midoriya Izuku. He whimpered, backing away and thumping against the wall behind him. He was starting to sweat, feeling like a trapped animal. Izuku, the man's smile grew even larger, taking up half of his face, Izuku. Izuku. He repeated, cackling to himself like saying the name gave him pleasure. He brought up a pale hand, fingers just peeking out of the simple black hooded robes he wore. His red beady eyes scanned Izuku's face. Then, he lightly grasped a chunk of Izuku's hair between his thumb and index finger, pulling it down right in front of Izuku's eyes so that he could see it clearer. Want to see a cool trick? He sneered, and then before Izuku could respond, he twisted his wrist around, moving his remaining 3 fingers to hold on to the clump of hair. With all 5 fingers touching the strands of hair, the hair he was holding in his hand disintegrated before Izuku's eyes, the small amount of particles blowing away. Izuku gasped in horror, his body trembled and shook, and tears began to form in his eyes. He was terrified of what would happen if the man touched his skin directly. What do you want from me? He choked out, teary-eyed and angry to be trapped. What do I want? The man repeated thoughtfully, taking a dramatic step to the side to stand on the wall beside Izuku and tapped his foot impatiently. Why Izuku, didn't you know? You, my friend, are a land god. If I eat your heart, not only would I become a god, but I could also live for at least another 10,000 years. And if I ate all of your major organs, I bet I could live forever. He tilted his head towards Izuku. You're okay with that, right? He winked. No. Izuku cried, and with a furious scream he brought his arm back, hand in a fist, and punched the pale man hard in the jaw. The man stumbled backwards, angrily cursing out in pain. Izuku took the opportunity to run, and he sprinted away, heart racing faster than it ever had before. He ran blindly down streets, turning in alleyways and making as many turns as he could to try and escape. But despite how fast he fled, every time he glanced behind himself, the man was close on his heels. Damn it, running in yukata is hard. He gasped for breath as he tried to not trip over his own feet. Izuku turned a corner sharply as he exited another alleyway. Something collided into his stomach, causing him to trip over his feet and roll face first into the ground, bringing the thing with him. Ow, Sayu croaked, crawling out from underneath Izuku. He stood up fast, picking her up and grabbing Ichako from the air. We need to go, now. What happened, Izuku-sama? Ichako said into his neck as Izuku held onto her and Sayu both, tight against his chest. That man, he panted as he ran past more shops, is trying to kill me. He said if he eats me he could live forever. Sayu peered over Izuku's shoulder at the man chasing them. I don't think he'd live forever. Just a few 100,000 years at most. Izuku-sama, Ichako said, beginning to wriggle out of Izuku's hold. You and Sayu-chan need to head out the gate and to the woods to get back. I'll go find Master Shadow, he can help you. No. Izuku cried, holding her closer, we don't need to bother him. Despite his appearance, Master Shadow is kind, Kiro. I don't think him saving your life would really be considered bothersome, Sayu insisted. He unwillingly let Ichako go, and she gave him a featherlight kiss on his temple. You two be safe. I'll be back soon. She hurried away down another street, and Izuku continued to sprint away from the man still chasing them. Sayu directed him where to go, but he was getting exhausted and could feel himself slowing down. To his relief, they quickly found the gates they had come in through earlier and exited. He ran down the foresty path, holding the frog girl close and feeling Sayu's tiny heartbeat racing in quick time with his. Without all the red lanterns that had been lighting the streets before, Izuku realized how late it had gotten. The forest was dark and chilly, trees swaying from a low breeze as the wind whistled. His chest and legs ached from how much running he'd done, and he cursed himself for not being more in shape. Leaving seemed to be taking way longer than it did to enter the spirit world. I don't know how much longer I can go like this, his voice sobbed out, turning Sayu's small body so that he carried her like a cradle toddler rather than over his shoulder. Izuku-sama. I have an idea, Kiro, Sayu said. She opened her mouth wide and wrapped up in her long pink tongue was an ink-dipped brush and some rolled papers. Izuku gaped at her in shock and slight disgust as she unrolled the damp papers with her hands and pointed to them. These are white talismans. As a land god, one of your abilities is to manifest powers from them, depending on what you write on it. Sayu jumped out of Izuku's arms, handed him the brush and papers, and kept up with his pace in long leaps. He nodded his head in understanding and so she continued, if you write on one of these talismans and affix them to a target object, those words will bring forth power and essentially come true. She suddenly stopped on the path. Let's rest for a minute. Sayu grabbed Izuku's sleeve and yanked him down into some leafy bushes where they could hide and catch their breaths. They huddled together behind the shrubbery, sitting on soft grass that was cold and damp. She nodded towards the talismans. Try one, Kiro. Izuku quickly scribbled words on a talisman. He reread it for a second and then lightly smacked the paper to the middle of Sayu's bangs. The word said, turn into a badass ninja warrior and beat the creepy guy up. Sayu blinked slowly, then looked up at Izuku with an amused smile. Izuku-sama, the power of the talisman cannot surpass that of your own abilities. He groaned, but his groan turned into a shriek as he looked up to find the blue-haired man standing over him, mouth open wide, lips cracked open and bleeding as he sneered down at Izuku. Found you, land god. Without a second thought, Izuku furiously wrote, slugs on the next talisman, and shoved it into the man's open mouth. He reeled back, eyes bulging wide in horror as a continuous flow of slimy, yellow slugs poured out of his mouth. Izuku scooped Sayu up and off of the grass and ran back to the gravel path, hoping to gain as much distance as possible. That was disgusting, Kiro. Sayu winced as she held onto Izuku with an arm around his neck. It was the first thing I thought of. He laughed sheepishly, cringing at his own choice of action. Heavy, loud footsteps came from behind them. The man was running even faster this time to catch up to them with his hands outstretched. Now I'm really going to kill you, land god. I'm going to crush your skull between my fingers and eat every last one of your delicious organs after I make you suffer. There was a puff of smoke that appeared in front of Izuku. He tried to move away, but he gained too much momentum from his sprint and ended up tripping over his own ankle, sending Tsuyu flying. She rolled safely to the side, her reflexes much more advanced than Izuku's. He stumbled forward into someone's hard chest as the smoke vanished, and together they fell hard onto the rocky pavement. Ah! Izuku yelped, looking into Shado's shocked mismatched eyes as they were falling. Their chins knocked against each other's painfully, making a clunking sound. Shadow tried to push Izuku off of him, pushing against the freckled boy's shoulder. At the same time, Izuku put weight into that side of his body to try and lift himself up. His weight caused Shadow's hand to slip and Izuku fell, again, only this time into Shadow's face. Their noses squished and their lips smashed against one another's with a loud smack. Shit, Shadow cursed as his body began to glow a faint white beneath Izuku. Izuku leaped off of him, screeching incoherent apologies, as his whole body seemed to blush bright red. He barely noticed Ochako and Tsuyu squealing gleefully with each other, too embarrassed to question them. "Shadow, I'm so sorry," he sputtered, flailing his arms wildly around his head in an attempt to hide his face. Shadow stood up quickly, body no longer glowing, but a light blush across his own cheeks. The yokai didn't look at Izuku, but past him, and with his right arm, he sent a handful of sharp knife-like icicles towards the robed man coming up behind Izuku. He yelled out in pain, then went eerily silent. Izuku hurried to stand beside Shadow and gained some distance between him and the pale man. They waited and watched as he brought a shaky hand to the icicles that stuck into his shoulder and disintegrated them. Rather than melting, they just seemed to vanish. He let out an insane laugh and smiled up at the four of them, ignoring the blood that dripped down from the open wound in his shoulder. "I'm not afraid of some silly ice, Todoroki Shadow," the man grinned slyly. "Are you trying to hog the human all to yourself? I just want a little taste." "This is getting irritating," Shadow sighed, tilting his head to the right to stretch his neck. He sent a wave of ice to the man, it ripped along the floor and then up the enemy's body, encasing him frozen solid and stuck to the ground from the neck down. The man tried to move his arms but had no luck. His fingertips were left unfrozen, as Shadow had been careful to not let any of the man's fingers touch the ice. He approached the shivering man. With an ugly sneer, he said to Shadow, "As cold as the rumors say, I see. Is it true that you're also too weak and afraid to use your father's flames?" Izuku looked at Shadow with curiosity. Father's flames? His breath hitched in fear when he saw Shadow's face. It had darkened incredibly, his teeth back and snarling and eyes stared menacingly at the man. The fur on his fox ears and tail seemed to puff out like an angry cat. Shadow's left arm went up, a small flame melting the ice on the man's right arm. He grabbed the man's wrist roughly, his long nails digging hard into his arm. The man winced, still smiling crazily despite the clear panic and fear behind his eyes. "No. No, please don't." He begged, laughing hysterically like someone would while being tickled, as Shadow pulled the man's hand up to his chalky white crackling face. Shadow smirked dangerously, "Go to hell, Shigaraki," and forced the man's own hand against his cheek. There was a blood-curdling scream, and then silence as Shigaraki's entire body turned into dust and vanished. Shadow's ice crumbled onto itself in a wet pile on the floor. Behind Izuku, the shrine spirits let out sighs of relief. Izuku himself stood frozen in place, body quivering in fear and adrenaline. He glanced hesitantly up at Shadow. The fox yokai gazed back, his face had softened considerably compared to before, and his eyes looked at him with what Izuku guessed may have been concern. "Are you alright?" he asked, warmer than Izuku had ever heard him speak before. Izuku didn't trust his voice, so he slowly nodded. His shoulders sunk and he let out a breath he'd been holding for much too long. Ochako and Tsuyu came up behind him. Ochako, whom was floating, gently gripped his arm, while Tsuyu grabbed the bottom of his yukata and patted his leg comfortingly. "We're glad you're safe, Izuku-sama," Ochako smiled sweetly at him. He rubbed his eyes quickly and sniffled. Yeah, me too. Shadow," Izuku called out shyly. The yokai hummed in response, looking off to the side and into the trees. Izuku licked his lips and then said earnestly, "Thank you. For saving my life." Shadow approached the three of them, face relaxed and hands resting along his sides casually. He scanned Izuku, and their eyes met for a moment before he turned his head to look down at Tsuyu. "Let's get him back home." Izuku couldn't stop the excited smile that spread across his face. "You're coming back with us." With a small huff of laughter, Shadow replied while walking past them, "Of course. I am your familiar, Izuku-sama." "Wait, what?" Izuku looked from Shadow to the shrine spirits for an explanation, but they just giggled at him shamelessly. "You sealed the contract between a god and familiar, Kiro," Tsuyu replied. Ochako winked at the confused boy, "When you kissed Dot." Izuku paled, dread washing over him. He clutched the fabric at his chest and spun towards Shadow, whose back was to him, but it was an accident. You don't even want to be my familiar. I didn't mean to kiss you. He pointed out hastily. The fox yokai kept walking, but turned his head to respond to Izuku, let's just give it a shot and see what happens. Now come on, let's get you home, land god. Only the side of his face was visible, but Izuku noticed the crinkle of his turquoise eye and the way his lips turned up just slightly. Izuku smiled at his feet, hiding his blush as he held onto Ichako and Sayu's hands. He couldn't believe Shadow had changed his mind. They followed after Shadow quickly, their footsteps soft on the dirt path. None of them missed the small but endearing smile that had appeared on the yokai's face for only a few seconds, but the three of them silently agreed to not mention it. The moment he opened his eyes, he realized something was very different about the shrine. Izuku sat up from the pillows. When did these pillows get here? And looked around. Even his bed wasn't the same floor futon that he'd fallen asleep on the night before. His fingers ran along the soft, silky blankets in humble awe. His entire life he'd been poor, there were even years when him and his mom shared a bed. So to wake up in a huge king-size bed, all to himself, with elegant bedding and feather-stuffed pillows, left him a little dumbfounded. As he examined the rest of his surroundings, he quickly discovered there was a lot more added to the once empty room. Framing the bed was a midnight blue canopy with gold stitching that matched the bedding he was currently laying in. Across from the bed was an oak dresser, beside it a traditional three-panel room divider. His bags he'd arrived in were stacked neatly on the floor, looking much thinner and emptier than they should have been. "Good morning, Izuku-sama," a voice said from the doorway. With a startled twitch, Izuku turned to face Shadow. The fox yokai bowed his head low and respectfully, hands stiff at his sides, the two shrine spirits jumping up from behind him. "Good morning, Izuku-sama. Do you like the new furniture?" Ichako asked in excitement. Izuku climbed out of the bed awkwardly, nodding his head in earnest, "Yes. But where did it all come from?" "Master Shadow prepared the shrine for you while you were sleeping, to make it more comfortable," Sayu explained as she began to straighten out the tousled blankets. "Oh, let me help you, Sayu-chan," Izuku said, reaching for the blankets on the other side. With two long strides, Shadow was suddenly beside Izuku and gently pulling him away. "You relax, I'll help Sayu-chan, and you can go eat the breakfast I've prepared for you in the front room." He stood in shock, blinking his eyes wide at Shadow. Okay. Thanks." Shadow tucked in the sheets and then gave Izuku a quick glance, and with no emotion to his voice said, "No need to thank me, Izuku-sama, I'm your familiar now, and I'm just doing my duty." Something about the whole situation made Izuku's stomach churn in discomfort. He quietly followed Ichako out to the front room, brow furrowed in thought. Shadow didn't seem so against Izuku now, that was for sure. But he wasn't being exactly warm or friendly either. The continuous title of Izuku-sama was starting to bother him, too. Ichako sat him down at a table prepared with food. His stomach growled hungrily and he sheepishly smiled back at her as she giggled at the noise. As he munched on rice and egg, he noticed that this room was also now fully furnished, unlike the day before. Against a wall was a large TV, some local news channel quietly playing in the background. There was a large sofa and a lamp against one wall, while another had a bookcase full of books and movies that Izuku promised himself he'd peek at later. "Where did all of this stuff even come from?" he asked the brunette seated beside him. Master Shadow got it, though he didn't say from where. "It's not as traditional as we had it when Momo-sama was the land god, but hopefully this more modern furnishing is suitable to your needs, Izuku-sama." "It's fine. Much nicer than what I had before," he insisted. She seemed pleased by his approval and then put some more food on his plate. "Is something troubling you, Izuku-sama?" Ichako asked after watching him eat in silence for a few minutes, dull eyes blinking at him curiously. He sat his fork down and turned to her. She sat on his right side, hands in her lap and her face kind. Her rosy cheeks smiled at him reassuringly and she nodded her head for him to answer the question. "I don't want to sound ungrateful." He started. He looked up to see Sayu walk in curiously, Shadow behind her. His face was still straight and unreadable, but Izuku found himself feeling less bothered by it. Izuku looked down at his lap. "Is it possible that everyone could just call me Izuku? Drop the sama." Ichako tilted her head in confusion, "But why?" He sighed, twiddling his fingers nervously, "It just makes me feel a little weird. I dunno, like you guys put me above you or something and I feel bad about it." "We do put you above us. You're God," Shadow stated as he leaned back against the wall. Izuku took a deep frustrated breath. "That doesn't make me better than any of you though. Can we try it out? Please?" The three shared a quick glance and Shadow nodded his head. Ichako wiggled in her seat beside Izuku, puffing her cheeks out dramatically. "Okay, Izuku." She held her breath, face turning pink. "It may take us some time to get used to, Kiro," Sayu admitted, "but we want to do whatever makes you most comfortable, Izuku." She dragged out his name, stopping awkwardly as she held back from adding the honorific. Izuku smiled warmly at them, "Thank you." "What are you doing?" With a timid shriek, Izuku fell on his butt and dropped the stack of books he'd been balancing in each hand and on his head as he was doing squats. Shadow knelt down beside the blushing boy to help him pick up the heavy books, then reached for the side table to grab the half-empty glass of water and hand it to Izuku. Izuku nodded his head in thanks and gulped down the refreshing drink. After letting him catch his breath and they'd picked up all the books, Shadow repeated, "What are you doing, Izuku?" "Exercise." Izuku replied sheepishly as he moved to sit on the couch. He patted the soft cushion next to him as an invitation for Shadow to sit with him. The yokai glanced at Izuku's nicely toned arms, presented amiably by the tight black t-shirt he was wearing to exercise in. Maybe Izuku wasn't as weak as he thought. He sat a cushion down from him, leaving some space between them. "You're trying to get stronger?" Shadow asked with a raised eyebrow. Izuku nodded. "If being a god means I'm going to have yokai or monster creatures coming after me on a regular basis, then I need to be able to defend myself and fight back." He pumped a fist into the air. The fox yokai stared at Izuku oddly, his eyes narrowed slightly, and replied, "You don't need to be physically strong when you have me to protect you." Redness returned to Izuku's cheeks. "Thank you, I guess. I'd still feel better about myself if I was a little more fit, though." "Then I'll train you," Shadow replied with a curt nod, "but I think you should prioritize strengthening your divine powers first." "Divine powers?" Izuku leaned towards Shadow eagerly, scooting himself closer on the couch. His excitement was so naive and childlike. Shadow gave him a suspicious look at their closeness, but didn't move away. "A god's power is called divine powers. Its strength increases with use, and so the quick and easy way for you to increase your divine power would be by listening to people's prayers and granting their wishes. Momo was known for matchmaking, and so soon I'm sure people are going to come to you expecting it. She had received many prayers of those seeking love, and she granted them, and so her divine powers of matchmaking are incredibly strong." "That makes sense." Izuku shouted, "I've been reading the amazing notebooks you filled, and I noticed a lot of them were seeking romance. This used to be a matchmaking shrine, huh?" Shadow's pulse jumped at the small compliment, but he ignored the strange sensation. "Yes," he replied, getting up from the couch, "I think it's important that we test your current abilities and see where you need to go from there." There was a poof of smoke and then in its place appeared Achako and Sayu. "We want to watch, Kiro." Shadow brought Izuku a clear glass of water and set it on the coffee table in front of him. "Turn this water into sake." Sayu handed Izuku a white talisman and brush like she'd given him the night before. Izuku neatly wrote out sake and then stuck the talisman to the side of the glass. The glass began to shimmer and glow, resulting in oohs from the girls and an excited gasp from Izuku. After a few seconds, the glowing stopped and Achako eagerly took the glass in both hands and took a sip. "Oh my." She sipped it again, closing her eyes peacefully. "It's delicious." Izuku grinned proudly, but then Achako continued, "Water. Delicious water." He groaned, sitting back and thumping his head against the couch. "How come I was able to make a bunch of slugs appear when we were running from that Shigaraki guy, but I can't even change a simple glass of water?" Sayu tapped her chin and thought, maybe because it was a life or death situation. "We can threaten to kill you if you don't turn the water into sake, if that'll help." Achako offered with a large frighteningly devious smile. Shadow shook his head, "Let's not. He's obviously not ready, we just need to start smaller. We'll have Izuku answer the next prayer that comes and hope that it makes him a little stronger. Baby steps, I suppose." He turned and walked to the front door of the shrine. "If you'll excuse me, Izuku, I have duties to attend to." He bowed his head formally, again, and then turned and left. Shadow sighed as soon as he was outside, pausing on the porch before getting to the yard work. He wanted to feel excited to be useful again, to be serving beside a god and taking care of Momo's shrine. But Izuku was so human. At this rate Momo's shrine really would be useless. It deserved better. They all did. They waited for Shadow to slide the door all the way closed before Izuku turned to the shrine spirits with a defeated sigh. "I think I disappointed him." "It's okay," Izuku saw. Izuku, Achako patted his hand reassuringly, "we disappoint him all the time, and he still likes us. I think." Izuku snorted, a small giggle that grew into a louder, more contagious laugh. Achako grinned up at him sweetly, pleased with herself for making him laugh. Sayu smiled contently, her eyes closed and tongue poking out between her thin lips. They thought it was nice, having a god again. Izuku was out on the sofa, snuggled up comfortably in a large blanket while he read more of the prayer notebooks. He was incredibly comfortable, the prayer notebooks always made him feel calm, and the tea Achako had made for him earlier sat warm and happy in his belly. Across the room from him was the TV, still on and playing the news, but he ignored it. He just liked the low volume on to keep the room from feeling too silent. When he heard footsteps approaching the shrine from outside, he sat the notebook down on the coffee table and waited eagerly. He sat up straight, waiting for the voice of a stranger. He really hoped it would be a visitor coming to pray. The front door slid open and Shadow walked in, carrying a stack of envelopes. Izuku's shoulders dropped and he held himself back from sighing out loud at the sight of the fox-eared man, no praying visitors for him to bless. He tossed an envelope into Izuku's lap, "There's some mail for you." "Already?" He gaped, ripping open the top letter and blanched, "Bills, my dad's debt followed me here too. I can't escape it." He threw the envelope on the table and pulled the blanket over his head. "Wake me up in 100 years," he moaned. Shadow sat beside Izuku on the couch and looked at the letter. His body stiffened and his fox ears stood straight up. "Your father owes this much, and you have to pay it?" he asked, his brows furrowed deeply and face so offended that Izuku wanted to laugh if the situation had been different. "He's a real jerk," Izuku's muffled voice whined from under the blanket. "I don't know how I'm going to pay off this debt. It's not like I have a paying job anymore, and I would never take money from the shrine." "I wouldn't let you," Shadow huffed in annoyance beside him. Just then, an ad on TV caught Izuku's attention. An exhausted-looking older man stared at the camera, his face irritated and tired. He had heavy, dark bags under his eyes and long black wavy hair. It looked like he'd forgotten to shave that morning. Behind him was an office of some sort, but it looked oddly fake, and Izuku suspected it was just a green screen. "Hiring on the spot, 2 p.m. today. Janitorial positions open. No experience required. Part-time. Hashi Stadium. Yes, the stadium Kayakajiru performs. $10 an hour." His voice sounded exhausted and rough, like the poor man desperately needed 10 shots of espresso. The channel went back to the news, showing a thin woman with way too much makeup talk about the weather. A clock on the wall showed that it was an hour till 2. Izuku turned to Shadow in excitement, the blanket wrapped around his head like a cloak. "I gotta go. I'll get the job and then be able to pay some of these bills. I don't have to worry about rent costs anymore, and so I bet I could totally take care of it all in no time." Shadow leaned back, his opposite arm sat over the armrest, and he dropped his face into his palm lazily. "I really don't think that's a good idea." Izuku poked his head out from the blankets, allowing them to drape around his shoulders. His hair was even more messy and curly than its usual craziness. He glared at Shadow, bottom lip stuck out in a pout, ready to object. Shadow brought his hand up, silencing Izuku before he could speak, and pushed the green-haired boy's bangs back, lightly scratching his scalp in the process. It was pleasant, but Izuku could only freeze in shock at the unexpected touch. "Soft," he whispered to himself, his mouth in a slight frown as he felt Izuku's hair between his pale fingers and against his cold palm. He combed through the dark green strands, seemingly fascinated with the soft texture and thickness. "Wow. What are you doing?" Izuku blushed, looking up at Shadow's face. He enjoyed the feeling of his hand in his hair, but couldn't understand why Shadow was touching him in the first place. "Nothing. Listen, it's not safe for you to be out working." Shadow lifted his hand away and flicked Izuku's forehead hard, causing him to flinch back in pain. "The mark of the land god is bestowed upon a young man like you. Bright and clear on your forehead. It's like you're just asking to be eaten by wandering yokai." Izuku rubbed his stinging forehead. "Why don't you come with me then? Since I don't really know how to defend myself against yokai just yet." "No," Shadow said, looking away from Izuku quickly and glared at nothing in particular. "I need to stay here and tend to your shrine, now that I'm officially your familiar. But if you really have to go, I have an option for you." He got up from the couch and left the room, but returned shortly with something in hand. "You can hide the godly mark with this. Your hair does a little, but this will be more effective. As long as you're wearing it, no one will be able to tell you're a god. Momo used to use this to pull her hair back when washing her face," Shadow explained as he forced something over Izuku's head, "but I think it'll work just fine like this, too." When Izuku waved goodbye, a bright red sweatband around his forehead and a shining smile on his face, Shadow stood in the doorway in a state of panic. His heart was racing and his chest hurt, and something about the shrine felt significantly colder without Izuku in it. Despite his internal struggle, to a stranger he may have looked only mildly disgusted. Tsuyu and Ichako appeared behind him, Tsuyu petting his bicolored tail affectionately. They knew him well, and by the small grimace on his face, they could tell he was troubled. "It's okay, Master Shadow," she croaked, "he'll come back. Izuku-sama is not Momo-sama." Shadow Izawa was an intimidating man. Izuku had thought that at this point, especially after being chased down by a murderous monster, his everyday human world wouldn't seem so scary anymore. But as he sat here being stared down by the intense black eyes of Mr. Izawa, a part of him almost wished that he was being chased by hungry yokai instead. They sat in a small office, its cramped space stuffy and smelled a little like cats. To Izuku's right, there was a coat rack with a yellow snuggie hung up on it. Izuku tried not to stare, almost tempted to ask about it, if not for the older man's menacing presence. Behind him, on the wall, was a gold-framed photograph of a younger and cleaner-looking Aizawa with a blonde man beside him, arms around each other. Izuku guessed it was a wedding photo. Another thing he almost wished he could ask about. The older man cleared his throat and leaned back into his chair. "You're hired." "What?" Izuku gaped at him, "But you didn't interview me? You don't even know my name." "Well, what's your name, kid?" Aizawa asked, his tone lacking any interest. Izuku told him and the man nodded his head, then pulled open a drawer of his desk. He took out a grey polo shirt and handed it to Izuku. "Izuku, you're hired. This is the only mandatory part of your uniform. You can wear any pants or shoes you'd like, but I'm going to demand you take off that ridiculous headband," he said, nodding at the accessory on Izuku's head. "Now get out of my office. You can meet your coworkers on the third floor, they've supposedly already started working, but they can catch you up to speed quickly, I'm sure." Izuku stood up quickly and bowed his head low. "Thank you so much, sir. I promise to work hard." Aizawa reached for the Snuggie and pulled it off the rack, nodding his head with one last thank you. Izuku left and headed for the elevator. After pressing the button for the third floor, he pulled the grey polo over his head, wearing it over the white t-shirt he already had on. He reached up to remove the headband, but hesitated. Shadow seemed pretty adamant that he wear it to protect himself. "Should be fine here, anyways," Izuku muttered to himself as he stuffed the red accessory into his pocket. "I'll put it back on when I head home later." As he entered the elevator, he noticed his hands were beginning to clam up. A new job with new people was always a bit nerve-wracking, and the realization of such made Izuku's stomach feel a little sick. But he didn't have time to fret because as soon as the elevator doors opened, a tanned hand grabbed him and practically dragged him out. "Hey." A very pink woman greeted loudly, wrapping her arms around his to lead him to a table and some couches. "Another newbie. Come sit with us and introduce yourself." The 5 others all turned to look at him, and Izuku quickly waved, his mouth a wobbly grin. "Hello. I'm Izuku. It's nice to meet you." He bowed as soon as the woman let go of him to jump onto an empty couch. "Nice to meet you, Izuku. My name is Mina," she said, her smile still bright and welcoming. Her skin was beautifully sun-kissed, her makeup colorful but skillfully applied. She wore neon-colored bracelets up her arms, and dangling from her ears were purple hoop earrings that matched her shiny sneakers. Her hair, though cut and styled similarly to Izuku's, was a bright pink and adorned with pastel hairpins. On the couch next to her, a boy with very straight teeth and flat black hair that framed his head waved back at Izuku. "I'm Hanta." The others went around the room introducing themselves as well. Next to Hanta was a blonde boy named Denki. He had a black streak in his hair that resembled a lightning bolt and wore very tight black jeans that flattered his long legs nicely. On the other couch across from them was a pretty athletic-looking girl named Itsuka that had long orange hair she wore in a side ponytail. With her sat Tetsu, a muscular boy with a loud voice and steel-colored hair that went down his neck. He wore thick-framed metal glasses, and he somehow pulled off the grey polo shirt, unlike the rest of them. "You all already know each other?" Izuku asked as he sat down on the floor at the end of the table. "Sort of." The blonde boy replied, "Hanta and I are childhood friends, and we've known Mina for a few years." Itsuka motioned to Tetsu beside her, "And we've known each other for only about a month now, I'd say. We were hired together." They both took turns explaining the job duties to Izuku and the other 3 who were also new hires. Izuku was relieved to hear that the job would be pretty simple, albeit a little boring, and after talking as a group about the tasks that needed to be completed for the day, they split ways and went to work. Izuku had only been working for a little over an hour when he felt someone tap on his shoulder. He finished tying up the garbage bag he was changing out, then turned to see Denki, Hanta, and Mina waiting for him, mischievous grins on their faces. "Dude," Denki took the bag from Izuku and used his free arm to grab Izuku. "Come with us. We just found something awesome." Okay." Izuku replied, hurrying after them as Hanta and Mina ran on ahead down the hall. He raised an eyebrow at their uncontainable excitement. Denki nudged him playfully. "You've heard of Kayakajiro, right?" He smirked. "She's like a pop singer, I think. I don't listen to music much." At his words, Denki's brows furrowed and his mouth twisted in distaste. Izuku coughed out a laugh, while the blonde scoffed. "Not just a pop singer." Denki exclaimed, throwing his hands in the air, "She's the queen of pop punk. She's so talented, she can play like every instrument and her voice is like an angel and she's so hot and." Hanta interrupted him, "Denki's like in love with her." "I'm not." Denki cried, his face turning crimson, "I'm just a fan of her music, that's all." "And her face." Mina winked, "Now hurry up you guys. If we're lucky, she's still here rehearsing." The 4 of them went to the elevator, the small room holding just enough space for each person to comfortably take a corner each. They rose up to the 5th floor, which Mina explained was a VIP-only floor during concerts. It was the top floor and had a completely different atmosphere than the rest of the stadium's floors. All the furniture was glamorous, a modern gothic elegance that made Izuku feel very out of place. Couches were made of purple velvet, the huge draped curtains were dark and shimmery, and the white lights did little to light up the black walls. "Now you guys have to stay quiet, we can't get caught," Mina whispered and ushered them through a door. They entered from the back of the room, from what appeared to be some kind of alternative exit. All the lights were off except for a single light center stage, helping to obscure them as they ducked down and awkwardly crawled between rows of chairs to get a better view of the young woman sitting on the stage. Her back was to them, her small body hunched over a black guitar as she strummed away at the strings in some kind of experimental melody. While attempting to get a better look from the back of the train of crawling adults, Izuku failed to notice that they had all stopped until it was too late. Izuku bumped into Mina, who bumped into Hanta, who bumped into Denki, who stumbled face first into the back of a chair and let out a pained crap. They all froze, holding their breaths as the woman on the stage stood up and turned. "Who's there?" she demanded, glaring into the dark. Her hands were balled into tight fists as she scanned the darkness. Ayaka was shorter and more petite than Izuku had expected. He'd seen photos of her around work but never paid close attention to them, so it still felt like he was looking at a complete stranger for the first time. Her hair was a dark violet color, cut short and choppy with blunt, straight bangs. She narrowed her eyes in the darkness, a little off from where they sat hiding. Her bottom lashes were long and eyes rimmed thick with eyeliner. She wore a crop top sweater that had "Rest in Peace" written across it, washed-out gray jeans with rips along the legs, black combat boots, and a simple black choker around her neck. "I'll call security," she threatened, voice unafraid as her dark plum lips frowned in irritation. Denki was the first to stand, hands up in mock surrender. "Whoa, sorry, didn't know someone was in here." He chuckled nervously. "Idiot." Mina stood up beside him, arms crossed in front of her chest, and she looked to the side with an embarrassed flush prominent on her cheeks. Hanta and Izuku stood up after her, both cautiously quiet. Ayaka looked unimpressed and sighed, walking towards a wall to switch on the lights. The four flinched at the sudden brightness and looked at Kayaka with guilty smiles. "You didn't know I was here?" she asked incredulously as she marched over towards them. Denki sheepishly grinned. "Nope. We were just coming up to clean. You know, doing our jobs and whatnot." She stopped in front of him, her chest almost touching him and her suspicious glaring eyes level with his collarbone. "So you weren't sneaking in here unauthorized to spy on me while I practiced?" He was bright red at this point, eyes wide and looking up and away from her, and no. Mina smacked him on the shoulder. "Oh, shut up, you idiot." She turned to Kayaka, bouncing on her toes. "Okay, we are so sorry to come in like this, but we are huge fans and just really wanted to see you. But we'll be leaving now," Hanta said uncomfortably as he turned towards Izuku and started pushing him towards the exit. "Sorry to intrude." Kayaka's eyes landed on Izuku and she stiffened. Her eyes narrowed at him and an ominous chill ran down his spine. Something in her face showed recognition, but anger. The strange moment was fleeting as she blinked and then looked back to Denki with a soft smile. "I guess you guys are fine. I love meeting fans." Mina cheered and then she, Hanta and Denki began to chat with the musician. Denki continued to make a fool of himself, twisting his words and stuttering nervously as he tried to hold the conversation. Izuku listened from the back, feeling a little anxious from the way Kayaka had first looked at him. Ayaka patted Denki's shoulder casually, ignoring his loud intake of breath as he gasped, starstruck. "Well, I'd love to continue chatting, I have some errands I need to attend to. If you guys are willing, I can bring you some autographed merch I have around 6. Will you still be here by then?" "That's when our shift ends." Hanta smiled and Mina squealed happily. "You'd give us merch? For free?" Ayaka turned to walk towards the stage, unplugging the amp and gathering up her equipment. "Totally. I'm not losing any money from a few stuff I have laying around and I love to treat my fans. You guys are the best." Hanta pulled his friends towards the exit again, Izuku ahead of them and waiting at the door with a polite but nervous smile. The black-haired boy called out, "We'll see you at 6 then. Thanks for being so nice to us creeps." "I'm not a creep." Denki protested and Kayaka snickered behind her hand. They quickly closed the door behind them and Mina and Denki exploded into chatter. "She was so cool." Mina sobbed, clutching Denki and Hanta's shoulders on each side of her and jumping up and down. "God damn it, I bet she does think I'm a creep." Denki whined as they headed back towards the elevator. Izuku chuckled at their excitement but still felt anxious. The menacing feeling he'd gotten when Kayaka stared at him wouldn't leave his stomach and it was making him queasy. He looked at the clock on the wall and saw that they had just over an hour and a half until their shifts ended. "Just a little longer," he thought, "then I can go back to the shrine." At 5:55, the troublesome trio showed up to drag Izuku with them. They quickly helped him put away the rest of his cleaning supplies and then he followed them out to the employee parking lot behind the stadium. Izuku smiled and laughed when they did and was sincerely happy to be included in their group, but for a reason he couldn't understand, he was feeling apprehensive about seeing Kayakajiro again. The four of them stood by the exit, enjoying the cool weather while they waited for the celebrity. Panta was complaining about a bathroom he had to clean when Mina suddenly put a hand over his mouth and shushed him. "Hot eye coming up behind you, Izuku. Everybody stay cool." "Hey, what's up? Do you need something?" Denki casually asked the stranger behind Izuku. Mina leaned into Hanta's ear and whispered loudly, "He's dressed so fancy too." Izuku turned to look at who Denki was greeting and his mouth dropped open. "Shadow." The fox yokai nodded at Izuku, then replying to Denki said, "I came to walk Izuku home." Mina wiggled her eyebrow suggestively. "Izuku? You didn't tell us you have such a handsome boyfriend." Izuku choked, turning bright red, and frantically waved his hands around. "No. He's not my boyfriend. Shadow he lives with me. We live together." Denki and Hanta snickered at him, and Mina just nodded her head sarcastically. "Ooh, oh, I see, roommates, I see, okay then." She started up a conversation with Shadow, asking him if his hair was natural, was he wearing two different colored contacts. Izuku wasn't listening closely, instead continuing to stare at Shadow in shock. The man wore his traditional yukata, but his fox ears and tail seemed to have vanished. Without them, he looked kind of wrong. Still handsome, but wrong. It didn't take long for Mina to get bored of Shadow, as his responses to her questions were short and he didn't seem nearly as enthusiastic to be talking to her. When she went back to talking to her own friends, Shadow put a hand on Izuku's shoulder to turn him so they could face each other. He leaned down into his personal space and narrowed his eyes angrily at him. "Why aren't you wearing the headband?" he hissed. Izuku took a step back and pulled the red sweatband out of his pocket. "I wasn't allowed to while working. Uniform policy, I guess. Do you want me to put it on now?" Shadow made a TSK noise, straightening up and turning away from Izuku. "It's fine. I'm here now anyways." "Why did you come?" Izuku smiled at him. He was excited to have someone to walk home with, even if the yokai seemed a little grumpy. The yokai looked away, frown deepening, "Just had a bad feeling and wanted to make sure you were safe, as you're familiar," he added rushed. "Thanks," Izuku said softly, looking down at his red sneakers. "I've had a weird feeling too, oddly enough, but I'll tell you about it later." Just then, the back door opened and Kayaka came out with a black messenger bag hung over her shoulder. She scanned their faces and then froze when she saw Shadow standing behind Izuku. Her grip on the bag tightened and she narrowed her eyes at him. She stood over by Mina and opened her bag, giving Shadow another wary glance. "I didn't know you'd bring someone else, so I only brought 4 things with me. Sorry." Izuku doubted she was actually sorry based off her cold tone, but he tried to give her a reassuring smile. "Oh, it's fine. Shadow doesn't care anyways, right?" He looked at Shadow behind him and saw that the yokai had stepped even closer to Izuku, so much so that he was almost touching him. The yokai stood over Izuku almost protectively, his face carefully blank as he stared back at Kayaka. "It's fine." Kayaka handed Mina some kind of purple material of clothing. It was folded up and wrapped in thin plastic packaging. On the top, tucked inside, was a thick paperboard with golden edging that had Kayaka's signature written on it. Mina squealed and thanked her excitedly as Kayaka pulled out the same thing for Hanta and Denki, their items black. She then pulled out another black one for Izuku and held it out expectantly for him to take from her. He glanced up at Shadow, who was still watching Kayaka distrustfully. Izuku swallowed and then stepped closer to Kayaka and politely thanked her for the free merch. She nodded, then told them she had to go, but would be happy to see them again another time. As she walked away, she gave one last wave towards Denki and the others and then frowned at Izuku. Her eyes flickered to Shadow once more before she quickly hurried back inside. Denki was already opening up the plastic, revealing a black t-shirt with Kayaka's name on it and an illustration of a pair of headphones. "Awesome. These aren't even available online yet." Panta was given the same shirt and Izuku assumed he was too but just held on to the package under his arm. Mina opened hers to reveal a purple mini dress, the front with the same headphone illustration and stripes down the skirt. She held it in front of her body and danced around happily. "Oh my god, this is going to fit perfectly. This is like the cutest thing I've ever seen in my life, I can't believe she just gave us these," she shrieked. Denki gave a love-struck sigh. "Kayaka's so cool." Shadow was looking away from them towards the road, obviously ready to leave, so Izuku quickly said goodbye to his new friends and promised to see them again tomorrow. "Shift is 1 to 6. Hanta reminded him with a thumbs up and signature toothy smile. "Thanks. See you guys later." Izuku waved as he and Shadow headed down the road together. They started their walk without talking to each other, though Izuku was subconsciously muttering to himself the entire time. Shadow listened in silence, not quite understanding what Izuku was talking about. He tried to listen, but only caught bits and pieces. "You mentioned you had an odd feeling earlier?" Shadow asked Izuku, interrupting his mumbling. The green-haired boy looked up at him in surprise, as if he'd forgotten Shadow was there. "Oh. Yeah. Yeah, I did. It's probably nothing. But I just got this weird vibe from Kyakujiru." "Weird how?" Shadow asked patiently. The name Kyakujiru was faintly familiar in his head, but he couldn't recall why. "She was super friendly with the others, but when she'd look at me I felt like, I don't know, like she despised me. But that makes no sense. I'm pretty sure I didn't do anything to her. Denki was making a complete fool of himself in front of her, but she seemed fine with it, yet I swear she had a problem with me." Izuku rambled on as Shadow nodded his head to show he was listening. "That's weird, right? 'Cause there's no reason for her to dislike me. I think. Is there something about me that could make a stranger hate me right away?" Izuku looked up at Shadow in concern. His eyes were wide and almost watery, his cheeks a little pink underneath the freckles that scattered across his face. For a moment, Shadow could only stare. He wondered to himself how many freckles there were on the smaller boy's face, how they also went down his neck and under the ugly polo shirt he was wearing. Did he have freckles on his whole body? When Izuku turned his head away to focus on where he was walking, Shadow noticed the way his dark green hair bounced as he moved. He suddenly had the impulse to touch it again, as he remembered how soft it had felt that morning. "Shadow?" Izuku frowned, looking back at him again. Shadow quickly looked away, his heart racing uncomfortably fast. "Odd. You didn't answer my question." Izuku sighed, "though I guess that's answer in itself. I guess you haven't really liked me since we met either." The fox yokai stopped walking. Izuku thought he disliked him. "She probably doesn't hate you. I know I don't dislike you." Izuku halted, a few steps ahead on the sidewalk. "You don't?" He tilted his head curiously, his expression unsure. Shadow's face softened. He knew he hadn't been super welcoming to Izuku since he'd shown up at the shrine. He didn't smile, but he tried allowing his face to look more honest, tender even. "I don't. The more I'm around you, the less concerned I am for the well-being of the shrine. I see that you're trying." "I'm so glad." Izuku's whole face lit up as he grinned in relief, then turned to keep walking. Shadow followed after, confused by the warmth he felt on his own face. He brought a cold hand up to his cheeks to cool himself down. "I think it's best you avoid her though," Shadow said a few minutes later once he felt relatively normal again. "You think so?" Izuku questioned, though he nodded his head in agreement. "Yeah, I'll try. Though it might be hard when the others are such big fans of hers." "Do you think she's dangerous?" Shadow asked. The freckled boy giggled nervously. "What? No. No. Honestly, I'm probably just being a little paranoid anyways." "Why? Do you think she is?" "I wouldn't know," Shadow answered honestly, "but I don't trust her. I'll come with you to work tomorrow to be sure that you're safe spending so much time there." Izuku spun his whole body to face Shadow, his face shining gleefully. "Really okay? Yeah. It'll be fun to have you there. You can even keep pretending to be human." He laughed to himself, mouth open wide and joyful. Shadow grimaced, looking away quickly and feeling a little blinded by the sight. There was something about Izuku that made his body freak out. He considered it to be a god thing, since he was Izuku's familiar, but he never had a reaction like this to Momo, despite how godly and ethereal she actually was. Their conversation the rest of the walk home was more quiet, as Shadow mostly nodded and listened to Izuku talk about his first day at work. The next day, Shadow sat alone in the lounge area of the third floor while Izuku worked. He wore casual clothing instead of his traditional clothes, as per Izuku's suggestion, to not stand out as much. Of course it didn't make much of a difference because of his unique hair coloring. He felt out of place, sitting in an empty lounge of a place for humans, wearing their lame clothing as he pretended to be one. With Momo, he would have never found himself in a place like this. Things were different now, he tried to remind himself. "The god I serve is working as a janitor," he muttered to himself. "This is humiliating." He laid back against the sofa, staring at the ceiling in boredom. The black jeans he wore felt tight and itchy on his legs. He wanted to go home and change back into his yukata. At least the blue button-up he wore was light and mostly comfortable. Ish. Shadow heard the elevator ding from behind him, but he ignored it. He closed his eyes, maybe he could squeeze a nap in. "Yo dude." A voice he didn't recognize called out, "You feeling okay?" Shadow turned his head towards the voice, only to look up at a blonde kid probably Izuku's age. He slightly remembered him from the evening before, and from Izuku's babbling yesterday, he guessed that this guy was Denki based off of his friendly smile and basic description. Especially the lightning bolt streak in his bangs. "I'm fine," Shadow responded, turning away. "Just bored, huh?" Denki asked, plopping himself down casually beside Shadow on the couch. He didn't respond, but Denki nodded his head as if he had and continued to try and chat with the yokai. So, how long have you and Izuku known each other? A few days, Shadow replied, taking a sip of tea from a coffee cup Izuku had given him on a break earlier. He held it in his left hand to keep it hot. Denki put his legs up on the coffee table and said in slight disbelief, "Oh really? New roommates then, huh? Hope that's going well for you. Weird though, I mean, you guys just seem so close already, so that's good, right?" The yokai nodded his head in silence. He could feel Denki squirm in his seat, obviously uncomfortable with the one-sided conversation. Shadow considered talking to him more, but then reminded himself that he didn't care if the human was comfortable or not. He continued to sip his tea while Denki started scrolling through his phone. There was a beeping noise, and then a slightly staticky voice spoke from a small radio clipped to the belt on Denki's hip. "There's been a spill up in Kayakajiru's dressing room," the voice said, sounding irritated and like he'd just woken up. She requested the green-haired freckled kid to come clean it. I'm going to assume she meant Izuku. Shadow choked on his tea, sitting up fast. Denki didn't notice his coughing, too busy groaning about how unfair it was that she asked for Izuku. The radio beeped again and a nervous voice that Shadow definitely recognized said, "Oh okay. I'll head there right away, Azawa, sir. Which room is her dressing room again?" Another beep and then a long sigh, "5th floor, last room on the right. There'll be a silver star on the door so you really can't miss it." "Beep, thank you." Izuku's voice squeaked. The blonde turned to Shadow, totally unfair that she requested Izuku. "Do you think he'd trade and I could go instead? Probably too late though. Man. I'm going to go," Shadow said, ignoring Denki's comments and quickly stood up, "Have to piss." Denki snorted, "K-man, have a great time." He walked quickly to the elevator, waited much longer than he wanted to for it to open for him, and impatiently pressed the 5th floor button as soon as he was inside. It slowly moved up, way too slow for Shadow's liking. As the doors opened, he saw that the entire floor was in pitch black darkness, every light shut off. He could sense an ominous presence, one that definitely wasn't human or friendly. His stomach filled with dread, there had to be a reason Kayakajiru had asked specifically for Izuku. That's it for today guys, hope you all enjoyed this video. If you do, consider leaving a like, share and subscribe. And don't forget to check out the author of this story. All details in description. Thanks for watching, take care.